Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Springfield Township Board of Trustees meeting. It is March 22nd, 2016 at approximately 5:30 p.m. We are here this evening to have a public hearing on the Township's 2016 permanent appropriations. And to help understand this topic, we have a PowerPoint presentation which Mr. Hennenkamp, our Township Administrator, is going to walk us through. So actually, we better do a roll call. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Mr. Bernie?
Present.
Ms. McFarland?
Present.
Mr. Honowa?
Present.
All the trustees are present.
All right, very good. Thanks, Mr. Burning. Now, Mr. Hennenkamp, we'll let you move into the presentation.
Like deja vu, you've had to do that roll call three
Well,
times.
this is, yes, this is the third. We've had two prior meetings
little
tonight.
unusual.
Yes.
Thanks, Mr. Hunterlaw. Just a kind of a quick overview of what we're going to present is just a little review of the budget process and the cycle that we go through, and then I'll just take you through kind of some of the highlights of the 2016 permanent appropriations, look at it kind of as a by fund, and then we'll take a look at 5-year projections based on this 2016 permanent appropriations. And then lastly, open it up if there's any public input or questions to the budget. So kind of taking you through the budget cycle, our budget process actually begins in July each year. We're on a calendar year, fiscal year, but our process actually goes from July, and this evening is really the final step of 2016's process. So we started actually with the tax budget that the board adopts in July. And what that budget actually does is shows our revenues and expenditures for the 2 previous years in the first half of the current, and then makes an estimate for the back half of 2016. So we went through and the board did that and took that action in July of 2015. The next step of that process is then the county budget commission then evaluates that budget and goes through a process where they call it's an actually certified. They send us back some amounts and rates that are given to us, and then in October the board goes through an action where we actually authorize the necessary tax levies and certify them back to the county engineer or county auditor. So pretty much a rudimentary process that we go through up to that point. In January of each year, or prior to January 1st, of any given year, the board is required to adopt temporary appropriations. Those temporary appropriations are required before the board can legally authorize. And again, just to kind of reiterate what appropriations, I think most people understand appropriations, but legally that is you're authorizing the amount by fund of what can be spent on any type of township action item. So that's essentially the process that you're doing. The only difference between what you're doing in January and what we're doing tonight are in January they call them temporary because you may not know all of the details of what you're doing, so you maybe don't have quite the level of detail in January, and then we come through in March and do what's going to be our final appropriations for that year. There isn't anything that requires there to be change from what you do on a temporary to the permanent, but oftentimes there are, and in this case, pretty minor changes, which we'll go through. Our 2016 appropriations, obviously appropriations require that there be revenue behind that to be able to make appropriations, and they're made up of basically 2 things. They're made up of our previous year cash carryover, which are allocated by fund, and also the estimates of what we expect to receive in new revenues in 2016. In total, our appropriations for 2016 are $27,237,535, and that is made up of about $21,600,000 of revenue that we anticipate to receive in 2016, and about $5.6 million worth of carryover from previous years. And that leaves us an unencumbered balance of $12 million, just a little over $12 million. Most people think of, when they say, well, what kind of savings does the township have, or what's your rainy day savings. We don't have a fund that is called that or a place to put those kind of funds. Those are just your carryovers that sit in all of those balances. And those balances are what make up those, that kind of rainy day, but it's done by fund, and that's how it's allocated. And the board has the ability to allocate up to that entire amount if desired legally. Again, what appropriations are really an authorization for expenditures, but just a quick highlight on some of the revenue side, because that's what allows us, obviously, to make these appropriations. And looking back as to 2016 revenues, when we passed the JEDs, we anticipated that it would make up a portion of the gap, the 52% of our revenue that we lost during the state legislature changes. And the actual result, as we talked about at the state of the township and as we've talked, has been much better. Our actuals in 2015 exceeded our expectations of what the JEDs would bring in, so it really made up that full difference in 2015. In this year's budget, we are projecting a revenue of $1.5 million. That would be slightly lower than what we received in 2015, but we tend to estimate revenues a little conservatively. There's no guarantee that we would get the same amount as last year. And we're still, because this JEDS is new, we're still trying to see exactly where it's going to, end. With any kind of a earnings tax, there's more volatility in that than property tax. The other issue is, and we talked about this, is also because of the newness, we thought that in 2015 there were a lot of folks that were still paying what they had owed in 2014. So it may have been a little artificially high due to that. Once we get a few years under our belt, I think we'll be a little better at estimating. But there's 1.5 projected this year. Also in 2016 revenues, there's about $1.43 million worth of road improvement grants. This is primarily through SCIP and CBDG funds, which makes up some of that. And in 2015, we received about 21% more in Grove and Senior Center revenue. So obviously that carries over and gives us a little higher balance in 2016, as well as some of the things that we've done from a programming standpoint with some of our consolidations and innovative programs. Obviously that led to savings, all of those things leading to a higher carryover balance that we're bringing into 2016. And then lastly, sort of the major thing that we did is we did the bond refund, which is saving us on our debt payments each year. And that will continue to do that for the next 13 years. But it's about a $75,000 a year savings that improves our bottom line from a carryover standpoint. So looking at the entire budget for the appropriation measure for this year, as I mentioned, about $27.2 million worth of money being appropriated. And that breaks down by fund, just a little under $5 million for our general fund at 4.8. Our TIF fund has about $932,000 appropriated. That's a fund that we'll talk about here in just a little bit, but is that we're going to utilize in a different way. And as you recall, the board took some action late in the fall that were, there were some changes in state law since we originally instituted that TIF district, and it used to be very, very limited as what you can use it. It's a little bit more flexible, and we're taking advantage of that flexibility to do some internal projects that we won't have to use general fund money for. Some of those other, just some miscellaneous, fairly small accounts and allocations and appropriations on our underground storage tank fund, lighting districts, recycling, and CDBG funds. The funds that are sort of service department and capital improvement related are as follows. Our motor vehicle license tax is $58,000 appropriated, gasoline tax $202,000, road and bridge $610,000, permissive at $267,000, and road district fund at $1.4 million. And there are also 8 separate capital project funds totaling $1.6 million that are in our appropriations for this year. I would probably add on those first 3 really pretty much on all of these funds. These are a little different than, say, our police and fire district funds, where you're basically trying to max these out each year. There's not a need to try to have carryover in these funds. You're trying to max them out and utilize them for what you can. Each of these funds and all of the funds that I'm showing on here, I think there's a total of 30 funds in this appropriation. All of them have restrictions. So every fund, including the general fund, has restriction. Obviously, the general fund has the least amount of restrictive nature, but every one of these other funds have things that we can and cannot spend money on as established by the Ohio Revised Code. Our fire-related funds make up our fire and EMS fund at about $5.9 million appropriated, and our ambulance and EMS service fund a little under $1 million at $948,000. Police district, the big fund there obviously is our police district fund at $8.5 million. You have a variety of relatively small funds. These are things that we get, forfeitures. They are highly restrictive in nature. Each one of those very, very limited as to what we can utilize them for. And in most cases, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, they do not allow any type of personnel expenditures to come out of them. So they have very, very high restrictions. And as you can see, not a lot of balances, but as we build them up and we have needs for certain types of equipment, those are when those funds are utilized. And 3 of those funds make up what basically funds DART. That is coming from grant and is the task force funds that you see. When you compare 2016, this year's budget, to last year, you'll see there's an increase of about $3 million. It represents roughly 11% increase, and that total is made up primarily of, as you're going to see, grants, capital improvement type projects, and tools and equipment. There are not a lot of operational changes to that budget. So just kind of go through that by our major funds. In our general fund, there's just under $500,000 worth of an increase, and that is made up of about $270,000 that we are increasing for the CIC. The bulk of that CIC payment is for the residential incentive grant, so a portion of the JEDs going back to township residents who pay into that. That amount has increased significantly because last year we only had 4 months. Now we've got the full 12 months, so obviously that same ratio of amount needs to be increased. We've also added the neighborhood enhancement program, something I think the board took action on at the last meeting, and so some of that money's in there. It's about $50,000 in internal sort of capital improvements that are in this year's budget, as well as about $376,000 of general fund money that we'll be expending on capital improvements. That's road project money. That's actually a match for one of our SCIP projects that's coming out of the general fund. It's actually the Brentwood project that should be starting here within the next few weeks. Overall, there's close to almost $225,000 of additional savings, where we're actually line items are less than it was last year, but the overall is up primarily because of the capital improvements, the CIC, and some of the internal projects that we're doing in the general fund. So operationally, really down, but up for those capital and CIC grant programs. Our road district fund is increased by about $350,000, and that increase is primarily due to some tools and equipment. There's a new salt truck in this year's budget, just something that we have about 17 salt trucks, and about every 2 or 3 years, you just got to replace them because the other one's coming out of its useful life. There's also a backhoe and a small pickup that's all part of the service department, and then a little over $200,000 worth of increase in doing more capital improvement. These are road projects, so road and or some type of drainage improvement to township right of way. The police district, this fund's up about $361,000. This would probably be the only fund that I would say is primarily due to sort of general operational. You've got about a $300,000 increase in personnel, And we're not adding budgeted positions, but we're getting fully up to where we are going to fill all of the positions this year. So we're in the hiring process, again, when I say not to add exceeding our budgeted amount, but we have been understaffed for about the last 2 or 3 years, and this is to get us back up to staffing. There are some increased fleet costs, and that's just basically the general cost of vehicles increasing and to fully outfit them, and then also the comp center fees. These are fees that we pay to the Hamilton County Communications Center. This is the 911 when people call that line. There's some increase, about $20,000 appropriated. Our fire district fund is up just under $300,000. Again, mostly from all line items. It's actually a reduction of about $35,000, but because we have some fairly expensive pieces of equipment that we're purchasing in a new squad, makes up the vast majority of that $325,000, but there's also a first responder in some miscellaneous equipment. So almost entirely made up of tools and equipment increases. In our capital and projects funds, and I mentioned earlier, there's 8 different funds. We have a total of about $1.7 million worth of projects. This is the one that gets very, very confusing. So, these are monies that have to be appropriated, but there's a portion of this, about $721,000, that's in this year's appropriation that was backed out of last year's. And the reason for this is this weird thing where we get skip money in, when a skip project is awarded, you don't receive the money until July of a year. By the time you get that money, it's probably late, if not toward the end of July. And again, I say get the money, authorized to use it. We never actually receipt that money, but you have to show it in your budget. It's what they call as recording only. And if it's a big skip project, it's very, very difficult to actually get that project completed in that same year. And what we have found is that where you've got a pretty complicated project, it doesn't make sense to start it in 1 year and either have the contractor rush to try to get it done, or you have to close it in December and reopen the project, in the spring, to where residents are then stuck with a project that's half complete through the winter. So our process has been not to start them until spring of the following year and finish it all in one construction season. We're also getting it out to bid earlier and generally get a better price because the contractors know the project's going to be out there. The problem from a budgeting standpoint, which is very confusing, is that money has to be appropriated in that year's budget and then backed back out at the end of the year because we didn't get it or use the funds, and then it has to be reappropriated in the next year. And so what you're seeing is that $721,000 is part of it from last year's project. There will also be, I've got $855,000, but there's actually the Hempstead project that'll be on there as well, which is in here, but it'll also have to be backed out at the end of the year. So very confusing as to how it follows in different years, but that's why. Our TIF fund, I mentioned that earlier. We're going to be using that for a lot of our internal facility improvements, specifically for the Grove and the Senior Center. This is one of the newly authorized utilizations of that fund, and these are projects and things that we're doing that need to be made. The roof, they're basic improvements that we're making to keep our buildings. We're not doing anything dramatically different with them. They're just upkeep things. But by using the TIF, we're not having to use the general fund for that, so it helps us save some fund. But overall, just up a little under $100,000. So in summary, when we look at these projects, the changes, or really where that $3 million really kind of comes out of these 4 categories, it's primarily due to the CIC and payments that will be made to the CIC for grants for our neighborhoods and for our residential incentive grants. It's up a little bit for internal facility improvements, especially, as I mentioned, through the TIF fund. Tools and equipment, there's a new township phone system. We've still got about a 14-year-old phone system, which is no longer serviced or can we get parts for, so we're looking at adding a new phone system for the township. We've got some software printers, big items like salt truck, pickup truck, backhoe, cruisers, our squad, first responders, and then luckily something that is desperately needed, The majority of this budget is capital improvements, and of course, that's where we know, our biggest needs are. This doesn't by any means answer that issue, but it's certainly better than we've been in a long time, and at least prevents us from falling further behind in this year's budget. If we look at what is different from a standpoint of how is it different from our changes from what we approved back in January with our temporary, we've moved a lot of those internal facility improvements, which were into the general fund, to the TIF fund, a total of about $331,000. I see there's a typo up there, zero missing. We've added some funding for a dangerous property. Actually, we did the hearing tonight, so to cover that particular dangerous property demolition and for any others that might come up during the year. There's been about $237,000 in capital projects and materials to our road district, different from where we were in our temporary. And then there's some specific line items throughout the budget, totaling about $40,000, and then changes to the DART funds, and that's all related to the grant that we received. So the impact in our projections, looking 5 years out, how do we look based on these appropriations? This is our general fund, and as I mentioned in all the individual meetings to the board, and Joe, you and Gwen, you can certainly remember this over the year. This is a fund that just by its very nature, while this looks scary and it's showing basically that our revenues are decreasing and our expenses are increasing, not dramatically, but fairly steadily, you see where those two lines intersect is essentially where you're out of money. I can tell you that I think this is the first year we've ever done the 5-year projection where it's actually carried out this far. So this is probably as good a shape as the general fund has been in, at least since I can remember, even though it's still not in great shape. And it's the issue that we know. Our revenues are fairly limited. What this is basically showing is that the savings and the things that we did since 2008 have allowed us to build up these revenues, and you're sort of using this amount. This, again, can be impacted dramatically because expenditures, we don't spend 100% of appropriations, so there's always going to be a higher carryover in that next year, or at least you certainly hope there's going to be, and historically there is. And we are pretty conservative on our revenue, the JEDS being the one that has the greatest opportunity. If it comes in like it did in 2015, obviously that's going to help. It's going to look better. But it shows that the general fund has a lot of demand on it in a fairly limited amount of opportunity. So again, when you go back to the JEDS and say this is with a JEDS that's doing about 28-30% better than what we expected, can you imagine where we would be without the JEDS? I mean, you wouldn't recognize this place. So again, it sort of explains that picture. Our fire and EMS fund, there is an assumption in this projection, and we do have 1 mil of the fire and EMS levy that will expire in 2017. So in this projection, I have assumed, for the sake of this projection, the renewal of that particular levy, and this is what the fire and EMS district fund looks like, assuming that levy is renewed. Again, that wouldn't be a tax increase. It would simply, it expires. We have to put it back on either as a permanent or as another 5 years. So it's really not a new tax, but it would be continuing the tax that's in place.
That possibly around 2017, is that what you?
It needs to be run in 17, so we receive the money in 18, unless you wanted to delay it and go a year, but obviously you would impact what we look like.
Right.
But assuming a continuation of that 1 mil piece, fire, EMS looking pretty good. Again, anytime you have a levy, you're generally going to trend like, it's going to look like this, but not too often in my tenure here have we had fire and EMS where you don't see it crossing the line, at least in that 4th or 5th year. And the same thing again, we're not going to spend 100% of appropriations, and hopefully revenues will come in a little better than we expected, but you're going to see a lot less volatility. These projections are going to be a lot more accurate unless something dramatic were to happen in the markets with property tax coming in substantially less. It's happened before, but it's a rare thing. And then the fire district is probably the police district is probably the strongest of all of them. You can see that the gap, this is probably as healthy as this fund has looked. I think this is a credit to, the way we've managed the department. Really, all of our department heads do a great job of managing their resources, but we have been understaffed for a good portion of the time, and that has led to some additional savings. We're also younger as a department, so we've had a lot of retirements, 30-year people that have come off, and so because of the pay structure, we've got folks that are at a lower pay schedule, and that's also sort of factoring into why we've seen a little better performance of the police district fund. So that's a pretty quick and dirty snapshot of our appropriations and how that impacts our three major funds, kind of on a 5-year projection. So I don't know if the board has any questions, but happy to answer.
Well, I guess I would just say, Mike, just for some of the people that have come here, everything that we're doing here is something that is state mandated. It's a process that all local governments go through. And I want to especially thank Mike, all your work in putting these presentations together, and actually, all the work that you do in our budgets. I want to thank all the department heads, Kim Cox, Kathleen, everyone who has a hand in this. When I first came to this board, we had none of this. And we did not have the long-range forecasting. We did not have the kind of analytical tools that we have now to be able to see where we really are. We had a state tax budget which really doesn't give you the full picture. We had what the law required, but we did not have this kind of analysis. And it makes a world of difference when you're somebody that's got to make a decision. Do we do this? Do we not? Where do we most efficiently spend the taxpayers' money? And this has been instrumental in, I think, us achieving some of the financial successes that we have in the township. I think the other thing that this shows is the township is solvent. Our finances are in good order. We have, given the extreme changes that we underwent as a result of some of the things that the state changed on us, it was the JEDs that has kept the township solvent. Without that, as Mike said, you would not recognize this place. With that said, and while there's been funds that have come in to help replace the losses that we had from the estate tax and the local government fund and other funds that were cut, we're not changing our operations. If anything, if anything, we've tried to be more frugal. We've looked at ways of combining services. Maybe the firemen are doing something that in the past development services did, or we're trying to have innovative ways that policemen can act as almost in a first responder type of role. And so we're cross-training, looking at ways that we can constantly reduce expenses. But we do have large capital needs. We have roads, infrastructure that needs to be replaced, and that's one of the challenges we have. We're going to be looking at every way we can, some new innovative ways to try and deal with those needs. But I think this tells a good story overall for the township. Anybody else have anything?
Well, I think that was reiterated when we went to Moody's and got our bond rating lowered to where we're going to save $1 million over the next 13 years just in interest from the bonds we already had.
That's right.
And I think with the department heads working together and really aggressively seeking out as many opportunities for grants and et cetera as possible, that has helped as well. And again, if it had not been for the JEDs, we would not be sitting here today like we are, and the township would look totally different. And when we talk about infrastructure issues, I just want to reiterate that it's not just Springfield Township that's meeting the same challenges. Almost every village, municipality in the whole state and the United States is looking at having infrastructure problems and trying to do whatever they can to enhance and improve their infrastructure issues. And I think, when I drive down 75 or 71 and you see all of the construction that's going on, everybody is faced with trying to improve the infrastructure. So it's not new news. It's news that we know that we have to try and get a handle on in spite of the dramatic cut in our budget at the state level. So I just want to, again, commend, as you did, Joe, all of the department heads for stepping out front. They didn't walk away from the challenges. They went to the challenges and came up with strategies and solutions to try to get us through. And I think the 5-year projection is just awesome. It's just really, really a great tool. And, we're always looking at softwares that can kind of enhance our ability to continue to be open and transparent. Our township has always been transparent. We've never in any way tried not to be transparent. And there's always opportunities to look at how we can continue to improve that transparency as well. So I think this is a good story, the permanent appropriations, and I think it was very detailed and thorough and somewhat understandable for the average person.
Really quick, again, it's a little different. I mean, we're on a cash basis, so our funding and government finance is a little different than what a lot of people are used to. It's not rocket science, but it is different and relatively unique. But I would just echo the comments of the board. I mean, we have such a strong team from the leadership of the board all the way down to our department heads, but it is probably, it is absolutely the right team right now. In every single area of our township, we've got the right people in place. And Joe, to echo what you said, the good news is, looking at us operationally, we are right-sized right now. We have the right people, we have the right, size, so I don't see our budget growing from an operations standpoint really ever. We don't think there's going to be new services that we offer, and we don't have to be bigger. Obviously, there's inflation-type costs that everybody faces, but other than that, we're at the right size. Capital improvements is our biggest challenge. Redevelopment, all those kinds of issues are challenges, but the capital is getting our hands around that issue is our biggest financial challenge.
Exactly. I noticed this evening that there are a number of people here in the audience that have come to listen to the presentation. Is there anyone that has a question for board or staff or a comment? If you do, we'd be happy to take them. I just ask you to come. Gary, would you come up to the podium and state your name and address for the record?
I am Gary McCarthy, a resident of Springfield Township. I live at 8794 Empire Court. You need the zip code?
That's okay.
I have another meeting to go to. Chris Trentman, one of my scouts, is going to be getting his Eagle tonight. And so I will make this mercifully short, coherent, I hope coherent, and get everything said I want to get said. I'm here representing the senior citizens who use the facilities of the senior center in the Grove. As we all know, in the past 4 or so years, there's times have been financially trying for all of us, and there was much belt tightening, and we senior citizens are grateful for your ongoing support of the facilities by keeping the senior center open. And we have shown our gratitude not only by an increase in our membership fees, but also our participation in the wide and various activities throughout the senior center. Many of us township seniors meet oftentimes over the week for things such as wood carving, art lessons, bridge games, hand, knee, and foot canasta games, all of which are kind of rowdy and raucous, but a lot of fun, as well as for woodworking and monthly movies. The Township Senior Center is important not only to us seniors, but also to the community family, which includes the seniors, because it provides a meeting place for us not only to participate in these activities, but to share in collegiality, getting to know our fellow citizens all the more. And I'm sure you are aware that the Sycamore Senior Center will be closing soon. I hear that there's a couple of more that are distressed, and the possibility of them continuing is now in question. But the Springfield Township Center thrives because the seniors took ownership of the situation and helped support its daily operations as much as their own resources permitted. Over the past years, our membership dipped in the beginning, but it climbed again as seniors realize how much there is for them to do here and what they get back from it. This is why the Springfield Township Senior Center is, albeit a hidden one, but it is an important asset to the community. Its very existence, availability, and programs contribute to the quality of life here in Springfield Township. You can't measure this in dollars and cents. It's what goes on, what activities, and just because you're retired does not mean that you're no longer a part of the community. This brings everybody in, everybody. So we hope that its membership will continue to grow and expand, not only to include seniors, but younger members of the community who will enjoy these facilities as much as we do. I thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Thank
We
you, Gary.
appreciate your comments. I can tell you, I think speaking on behalf of the board and really our staff, we value the senior center very much. I agree with your comments. It is a valuable resource to the community. It is that place that provides an opportunity for, as you say, collegiality and interaction for a lot of our senior citizens and other people. And we value it as an important asset of our community. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to address the board, either with a question, a comment, anything of that nature? Okay. It appears that there is not. Is there any, are there any other comments by the board? Questions?
Nope.
I have none at this point.
Anything else, Mr. Hennenkamp?
No, we just closed the public hearing, and then we do have action. The actual reason for this meeting is the adoption of
Correct.
Resolution 22-216, which is actually adopting those permanent appropriations.
Correct. Do we have a motion to close the public portion of the meeting?
So moved.
Second it?
All those in favor?
Aye.
The public portion is closed.
Okay. Then next, before the board, we have resolution number 22-2016. This is a resolution adopting permanent appropriations for Springfield Township for fiscal year 2016. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Seconded.
Mr. Vernon?
Aye.
Ms. McFarland?
Aye.
Mr. Honalaw?
Aye.
Resolution carries.
And with there being nothing else before the board this evening, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second it?
All those in favor?
Aye. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for coming.